I wanted to start off this inaugural episode with a team I think some people have heard of by name, but a lot more know via their incredible and varied catalog of work. I'm talking, of course, about Bizarre Creations, as they were, lamentably, gone too soon. Founded all the way back in 1988 in Liverpool, England by one Martin Chudley, the most British name I've ever heard, the small team of just about 5 people were originally dubbed Raising Hell, a name that was definitely designed to stand out because it certainly turned a head or two in the late 80s. These Hellraisers were quick to set to work as the UK scene was positively booming at the time, and while not their very first title, a distinction that would go to the very little remembered Combat Crazy, The Killing Game Show was their second effort and a very impressive follow-up. It was a platform shooter that saw release in 1990 on the Amiga and eventually onto the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis courtesy of all people, Electronic Arts. While EA seemingly had no problem with the branding of the game, it was of course family-friendly Sega that did.
That's no good.
For them to allow the release of the Killing Game Show on their 16-bit machine, 2 things needed to change: the game's title and the developers as well. Killing Game Show was then pointlessly changed to Fatal Rewind, as I guess the word fatal was much more palatable to Sega, but Raising Hell finding another name took a bit more doing. It might seem a bit much now to have to change your company's whole branding and trademark just for one port, but in the early 90s the home console is where you want it to be, as it would eventually be the place that Bizarre would go on to thrive. While a few names were bandied about like Weird Concepts, they settled on Bizarre Creations with an appropriately bizarre new logo, as you can see. As for the Killing Game, as for Fatal Rewind itself, it drew favorable comparisons to such titles as Turrican and featured impressive visuals and music for the team's second effort. Now, while it didn't particularly stand out in a torrent of action shooters being released in the 90s, it did catch the eye of another prominent UK-based studio. Enter British as shit Psygnosis Software, a company I feel needs no introduction. Yeah, I'm not gonna look up Psygnosis, they're awesome, you'll be proper chuffed or whatever. They and Bizarre teamed up for their next few projects, starting off with a bit lighter with Wiz and Liz, a magical fantasy platformer with classic Psygnosis-ass box art. Oof, look at that thing. The title did well enough for the partnership to then continue, which led to Bizarre getting behind the wheel for their first crack at another genre, racing. This resulted in a plain but competent duo of Formula 1 games for the original PSX. This then immediately sparked something within the company and would have them heading down a road they would eventually excel at. The year 2000 saw 2 more titles from the company, an obscure but unique action shooter named Fur Fighters and the Dreamcast gem Metropolis Street Racer. The latter was lauded for its graphics, control, and the unique Kudo system, which Bizarre would later reiterate on. Now, Fur Fighters was a smaller release published by Acclaim, but Metropolis was a first-party release distributed by Sega, as the European division of the company, who had been impressed by Bizarre's F1 titles, signed them to develop the Dreamcast exclusive racer. By many, Metropolis is considered to be their first big hit Bizarre had under their belt, but its success led to another franchise, the one that would become synonymous with the British studio. That's a bit of a running theme that you see with Bizarre, as the quality of each title would then lead to more work from different publishers, which culminated in their most successful period, teaming up with Microsoft to produce 4 games in the Project Gotham Racing series. Gotham further refined that Kudo system, which would reward players with XP the more stylishly they drove. The game would go on to be, at that time, Bizarre's biggest hit, selling more than 1 million copies in a month, as it was an Xbox OG launch title. Not to be outdone, 2002 also saw one of Bizarre's few dips into the licensed IP pool, that being Disney's Treasure Planet, one of the House of Mouse's, Marvel's, and Star Wars and Fox's biggest animated box office bombs. Not only was the movie largely ignored in theaters, the game is remembered even less. This is one of the few blemishes on the company's resume, and honestly, the game itself is a simple, run-of-the-mill action game, and if this is the worst title they made, they should be proud. Project Gotham 2 followed in 2003, instituting some of the earliest DLC that came to the Xbox in the form of additional cars and entire new cities to race in, containing 7 tracks each. Both these packs cost a staggeringly reasonable $3. How I miss the 2003 marketplace. This is also the game that inadvertently spawned the company's second biggest creation, Geometry Wars. Starting out as a minigame in Gotham 2, it would become a huge digital hit in its own standalone releases, and for a time was the most downloaded arcade title ever, cementing the game's status as one of the most notable shmups ever released. Bizarre would then switch between Gotham and Geometry Wars sequels across the life cycles of the first 2 Xboxes, leading up to Project Gotham 4 on the 360. This last title in the series would push the franchise about as far as it could go on that hardware and in terms of features and modes, but it would still sell millions of copies. Now, why this would mark the last game for such a successful IP when it could have seen even more refinement can be narrowed down to one specific reason, one tiny little company who took a sideways glance at Bizarre and said, "Yeah, I'll have a bit of that, why not?" Activision. Before that deal was finalized, however, they still had to finish up their last remaining projects for other publishers while they remained an independent third party. This included Sega's The Club, which was a cross between extreme sports a la Monsieur Tony Hawk and lightning-quick third-person action shooting. You traverse short levels, wall jumping, vaulting, and shooting in a combo-based affair where you'd then be graded on how fast and stylishly you blasted through it all. EA then also wanted a piece of that sweet Geometry Wars pie and partnered with Bizarre once more with Boom Boom Rocket, a rhythm game that used colorful explosives to rack up high scores that, while it didn't reach the heights of Geometry Wars' addictiveness, was still an enjoyable digital experience. Now, while both these IPs are not the highest rated commercially or critically, they're both concepts Bizarre could have expanded upon and grown, but like previously mentioned, all that came to a close once Activision took over. At the start, things seemed like business as usual. Bizarre's first release under the Activision banner was a sequel to Geometry Wars, Retro Evolved 2, which continued the franchise's streak of quality. Now, part of the deal between publisher and developer here was that Bizarre had to put out successful projects that needed to reach a certain sales threshold within a 5-year time span. And while the various Geometry Wars titles that were released on other platforms like the Wii were all reviewed highly, they weren't exactly selling the numbers Activision could bank on. Those hopes would be pinned on 2 big multi-platform console projects, with one being a return to their racing roots, while the other featured an unmistakable British icon. Blur was released in the first half of 2010 and could be best described as Project Gotham Racing meets Mario Kart. That other high-profile project was Bizarre's second encounter with a licensed IP, this time being James Bond himself with 007 Bloodstone. Unfortunately, the high-risk, high-reward of both these titles succeeding is what sealed the fate of Bizarre Creations. Blur and Bloodstone were both scheduled for 2010, so it was all hands on deck as they had no other projects in the pipeline. Blur, as mentioned, was a high-octane racer that featured blistering speeds and power-ups to wreck your opponents, and it was something a little bit different for the company. In reviews, there were some concerns with power-up balancing, but overall received positive scores. The team at Bizarre, however, felt good about Blur and even started prototyping a second game as there was lots to build off of. However, as sales numbers slowly trickled in, the studio was getting less and less communications from Activision, thus no other projects were getting officially greenlit. It quickly became apparent that Bloodstone needed to hit store shelves and it needed to do well before Bizarre could start up a new round of development. As the months ticked down to November, Bloodstone's release date, tension was high as by then, Bizarre knew something was up. Blur did not move units, it never got any DLC, and the proposed sequel was still languishing in the prototype phase, so a lot was riding on the shoulders of Bloodstone. Some of you may know where this is going. In 2010, Activision was pushing The Secret Agent very hard that year, but had another great UK-based developer working on a completely different James Bond title. Released on the same day, Bloodstone was up against the Wii remake of GoldenEye, which is of course a front-runner for the most popular movie-based game of all time. Hell, even GoldenEye's song got to be remade with Nicole Scherzinger from the Pussycat Dolls. Who did Bloodstone get? Josh Stone? Now let's say you're a shooter fan, or a Bond fan, or, you know, both. Bizarre's effort was exclusive to the PS3 and the 360, and GoldenEye was only on the Wii. Which do you buy? While that might be a bit subjective to some, the numbers don't lie, and they spell disaster for Bizarre at Sacrifice. GoldenEye would go on to sell well more than 1 million copies on Nintendo's machine due to the heavy marketing muscle thrown at it, as it was a great example of a quality third-party title for the system. Bloodstone, however, which was a solid, polished third-person shooter that also leaned heavily on Bizarre's racing acumen, featuring incredible vehicle sections filled with wanton destruction. In terms of negatives, however, it was viewed as fairly generic in terms of mechanics and had a ho-hum narrative. As you might expect, again, GoldenEye ate into the sales potential of Bloodstone, and it wound up with jury sales numbers that violated the agreement both companies had signed back in 2007. Very quickly, like really quickly, just a week later, Activision made it known that they were seeking a buyer for Bizarre Creations, and not wanting to blame their very recently released movie-based shooter, cited Blur's performance as the main reason behind the sale. Over the past 3 years since our purchase of Bizarre Creations, the fundamentals of the racing genre have changed significantly, said the horrible huge conglomerate. Although we make a substantial investment in creating a new IP, Blur, it did not find a commercial audience. Yeah, no shit, cause you released it a week after the exact same game came While it's impossible to say how things could have played out if release dates could have been shuffled or maybe more marketing money could have been spent, the idea that the racing genre had significantly evolved since Project Gotham 4 was kind of a horrible excuse. I know what you're thinking here. Now, while it's certainly easy to dump on big corporations like Activision for perceived slights and assumptions about how they treat their developers, it's even easier to do so when those former developers speak out. Ex-commercial director Sarah Chudley said in an interview with Edge magazine that Activision would get, quite pushy with the design of Blur. From design meetings through feature choices, locations, and the name, and even the branding, it was a big change from how we'd worked in the past. Martin Chudley, in the same interview, also expanded upon this. We weren't an independent studio making our games anymore. We were making games to fill slots. Although we did believe in them, they were more the products of committees and analysts. The culture we worked on for so long gradually eroded just enough so that it wasn't ours anymore. A lot of the features in Blur echoed this, especially when you knew who was actually calling the shots. Loadouts and perks in the multiplayer, Facebook-style UI, flashy neon nightclub vibes, all the things that were maybe designed by marketing and not necessarily, you know, game designers. After 3 months of searching for potential buyers, however, the axe officially came down, and Activision announced they were shuttering the studio for good. In a few interviews, former Bizarre staff recalled gathering and playing their backlog of games and went out knowing they had made some great pieces of software. Bizarre was considered part of the old guard, having remained in operation for over 20 years. From platformers to racers to puzzle shooters to action games, licensed IPs or original creations, Bizarre was a developer that showed a great capacity for variety, but who could also reiterate their work to make impressive sequels that pushed the boundaries. They never made what one could consider a bad game, and were plainly a victim of the overstuffed, content-heavy world the industry was quickly heading towards, with a hearty dose of corporate meddling. Bizarre Creations, we salute you for your incredible portfolio of titles, and lament that you were indeed gone too soon.